we start. Jerry, few people start with the intent of becoming an epidemiologist. So can you describe for us your path that brought you to epidemiology?
Well, actually, it was very simple. I was already, as a young graduate, I was already into rheumatic heart disease, which I had sort of adopted as my favourite problem, influenced very much by a lot of the patients I'd seen at UCH and by what I'd picked up, that there were a lot of social connections with rheumatic heart disease. So I started quite ignorantly trying to get community pictures of it, long before I'd heard of epidemiology or anything like that. And was soon analysing Registrar General statistics on mortality from heart disease in children in relation to social conditions and so forth. Eventually, this led to the first paper I did that, but by then I was working with Richard Titmuss, and the first paper we produced together was on the social aspects of juvenile rheumatism or rheumatic heart disease. I can't remember what we called it. It was in the Lancet in the summer of 1942. So I came into epidemiology through social medicine and public health. Epidemiology was obviously the technique, the methodology, the approach that I needed.
And were you working clinically when you started
Very
to do
much
this
so.
work?
I worked clinically right through. I qualified in '34, and by the beginning of 1939, I took my membership and I came straight here and enrolled for the DPH in September '39, by which time there were other things were happening. So in fact I came to do the DPH here in 1946.
Right.
And it also meant that I did 5 years more clinical medicine during the war. I was a physician. I was a medical specialist during the war, so I had 5 years extra clinical medicine, which meant in fact that actually I had 10 years clinical medicine before I came into this field.
And was there any formal epidemiology taught in DPHs? Those are diploma in public health. Was there any formal epidemiology in DPHs at that time?
In our DPH, well, Bradford Hill was our main teacher.
Okay.
And an exceptionally good teacher. I've often looked back on him as being the model teacher. He used to prepare his commas. And so that we got an introduction to epidemiology teaching then. And Robert Cruikshank, who taught us infectious diseases, he was also very much epidemiology. So it was quite a bit, but it didn't relate to the kind of epidemiology that I was soon to get into when I set up our MRC unit.
And what do you think is the biggest difference between epidemiology as it was practiced when you started your career and how epidemiology is today?
Well, it's entirely different. Today epidemiology is a mature science with journals and textbooks and university degrees, university departments and university degrees. And it's all over medicine. Every article, it's just a commonplace to have an epidemiological attachment to whatever the clinical article is, and in my time there was nothing like this. We were creating epidemiology as we went along. There were a tiny handful of us. I suppose you might say with a vocation nowadays, epidemiology is a major industry. Huge numbers of talented people. And it's universally accepted. One of the things we'll talk about later is how epidemiology became accepted as a major force in medicine, because the pioneers hadn't done this. Major Greenwood and people like that, they hadn't made an impact on medicine, on medical sciences, or very little. And we'll talk a little about this later.
And who would you single out as having the strongest influence on your career?
I suppose in all fairness, I must say Mellenby, the secretary of the MRC, who, out of the blue, on the basis of about what I'd published by myself and what I'd published with Richard Titmuss and what I suppose he picked up from his pals, invited me to think about setting up a unit. Then the MRC, usually they had a selection, they had a committee to consider this, which meant for a whole day. Jim Spence was the chairman of the committee. Actually, the most penetrating questions were by a leading surgeon, Lermont, who was a professor of surgery in Glasgow. I found it very interesting. He was the most acute in the discussion. James Spence was the chairman, Leslie Witts was on the committee. The rest I can't recall. We spent a whole day and they set up the unit. They recommended the MRC, which set up the unit.
And in terms of epidemiologists, who do you think as being the 2 or 3 most important epidemiologists during your lifetime?
Well, I must say about Major Greenwood. I read everything he published. Goldberger, when I discovered him, I thought he was still much unappreciated in this country. And Bradford Hill, I suppose, although he was mainly statistical, but I would think these 3.
And what do you see as Greenwood's contribution?
Well, it showed how you could tackle problems in cancer and problems from the population point of view, although in fact he could contribute very little. It was really pioneering stuff. He also wrote so beautifully that
it absolutely.
made one feel inferior for the rest of his days, and his Latin quotations and his Greek quotations came out quite spontaneously. they were all there. He was very kind to me. I remember the very first job I did. As I say, I got my membership in January '39, and I had 9 months to fill in before coming to the school, so I did a job in Nottingham as physician to the city council. They were changing the pension schemes for the council workers, and they wanted a medical examination of all their council workers. And I remember going to see Major Greenwood, and I didn't know him, who very kindly agreed to see me, and we had a long discussion about the sort of things I might look at and look for. And this was a great experience. I mean, it was I found most extraordinary things to me as a clinician. A bunch of cases of neurosyphilis from the First World War, undiagnosed, unreported, checked by, I got all such things, of course, checked by the local chief physician. I remember bringing that back to UCH and didn't know what the heck was going on. And this was a very instructive.
Because in Epidemics and Crowd Diseases, and I think 35, he has that chapter. There's one chapter on cancer, which he'd also published as a paper about the same time. Did he have any other really interesting chronic disease, though? He didn't seem to develop that ever anywhere.
No. Well, he had something as an occupational disease. In fact, he may have had a job in I'm pretty sure he was attached to the occupational health. I'm a bit vague. I'm pretty sure he was attached to that. He was interested in that. But when I came, I spent an afternoon discussing what I might do in Nottingham. And he was quite taken with the possibilities. Here was a real population, even if rather an odd one. And he was very keen that I should try and get something on what I suppose today you would talk about emotional factors, and which were quite beyond me to do anything about.
And you mentioned Goldberger. What do you think his...
Well, politely, that was a marvellous thing, including the experimental work. And he wrote so beautifully, and quite unappreciated in this country. I can't remember now how I got hold of him. That's Goldberg and Seidenstreicher, I suppose one should say. Seidenstreicher was more deliberately social medic of the two of them, I would think. But it's interesting, apropos something I'll talk about later, that these people had very little impact on medicine as a whole.
Yeah.
And then how medicine should tackle problems. And I more or less started from scratch in terms of establishing how coronary heart disease, for instance, has got to be looked at as in the population terms, as well as in clinical terms, in laboratory terms. The very first observation we made on coronary heart disease was this business between drivers and conductors. Well, the main difference there was in sudden death as first clinical manifestation of coronary heart disease. And this alerted me, how on earth do you pick this up? Any other way? I was already in touch with the London Hospital, with the biggest cardiological practice in Britain, maybe even in Europe, huge clinical practice, and this remarkable post-mortem study of, and I couldn't visualize how in the London Hospital they could pick this up.
Yeah.
And so, well, I went on to, we might talk about this later, but later on, not through pathology, I got onto this business about silent infarcts. And what they meant, I had no idea. We still have very little idea. And again, how do you study this? But the clinching one actually was really quite amusing. I was at the London, and as I say, they had this huge cardiological from history where Sir James Mackenzie, came there. And it struck me, we never see a ruptured heart. According to the textbooks, this is a regular complication, and it just suddenly struck me that neither in the wards, where you wouldn't expect it in the wards, but in the postmortem. And so I phoned up the coroner's pathologist who covered the same district as the London Hospital, same population. I said, look, what's going on? We never get a ruptured heart. Ruptured heart? I get 2 a week. And again, you see, but it's very interesting. I showed all this to Hemsworth, who was the secretary of the MRC, my boss, I suppose you might say, in effect. And very interested. He was a diabetologist originally before he came in. And during the war, he'd done a social job. He was responsible for the diet of diabetes and such issues, advising government, and he was very interested in all of this. He insisted, by then we're talking about the late 1950s, maybe early 1960s, that you must show this to McMichael. Sir John McMichael was the leader, the Führer of clinical science, professor at Hammersmith, where the brightest young physicians from all over the world used to come to do a postgraduate stint. And I remember showing him all this, and he said, rubbish.
That was it.
That was it. That was it. And but this, we lived very excited. We were very fortunate compared with you people. When we came out of the war, there were 3 major diseases, epidemic diseases, you could borrow the term from Greenwood, virtually unknown: coronary heart disease, lung cancer, and duodenal ulcer. I suppose one should say peptic ulcer, really duodenal ulcer. And there they were, just waiting. And I, because of my interest in heart disease, I went into coronary heart disease, and it was virtually unknown. There were little bits and hints about biochemistry, little bits and hints about diet, but there was nothing really known about it. And there was no literature, which is a wonderful situation. You go to the RSM, you could read the literature. You see, before you had tea, you cover the literature, and leave some German paper or something to be translated by a pal. So we were starting really from scratch. You've got nothing like that now. At least, I suppose you had with Alzheimer's, but you've got to tackle different kind of problems now to be in that kind of situation. And nothing is as clean and as empty as these situations
Yeah.
were.
Which I suppose that brings us to Bradford Hill, because you mentioned Bradford Hill as your third most important epidemiologist during your lifetime. What do you think?
But even he, no, it's interesting. I don't know whether I've mentioned it, but the first problem I had to grapple with was incidence. And how do you define incidence of disease like coronary heart disease, which I knew from my pathology, by the time you get to middle age, virtually the entire population has got coronary artery disease. I mean, it's very interesting when you meet somebody middle-aged at post-mortem who hasn't got coronary artery disease, and you find they came from Thailand or somewhere. But how do you define incidence in a condition like that? Bradford Hill, in his textbook, which I knew of by heart, I'd learned of by heart during the war, doesn't distinguish between incidence and attack rate until well into the 1960s. And eventually, I remember I spent, in 1947, I went to the States. I spent time in the States, and I spent a week at Hopkins with Laurel Reed and Margaret Merrill, who were you might say, the opposite numbers of Major Greenwood and Bradford Hill in Hopkins. And I brought this problem to them. And we spent virtually the week discussing. They knew nothing about coronary heart disease, which was very interesting. And eventually we agreed that tuberculosis was the only sort of model that they could think of that might be helpful. And in terms of incidence, that the only thing you could realistically go for would be first clinical manifestation. Then there were endless discussions on what you're missing out and what you're risking by going for this very late manifestation. And of course this was long before we talked about life course disease and all that sort of thing. I mean, the words weren't there, and certainly the ideas weren't there. At least if there were ideas there, we didn't have them there. So I say there were very exciting times, and very much more favourable than the time that you've got, than what you have to face up to.
Which do you think's been your most influential paper?
Oh, it has to be the physical activity paper. And that was very interesting. It was published in the Lancet at great length, which was a mistake. But the Lancet have adopted our unit. The Lancet were very taken with the sort of things I was doing during the war. And Fox wrote to me when I was still in India or Burma, and the war was coming to an end, asked me to come and see him when I got back home. And he virtually adopted our unit, and we published pretty well everything we did for a long time in the Lancet. And he became a personal friend and political friend. He engineered our transfer to the London Hospital and so forth. But that paper was very interesting. It had no impact in this country at all on cardiology.
This is the 1953
Yes.
paper. Okay.
The newspapers took it up. I had no idea how to handle them. They made a fool of me, but still, not to my discredit, I hope. But the Americans were very excited about this. The director of NIH flew over to see me, because this was the first time there was an indication of something that's related to this new epidemic, physical activity. He flew over, became great friends, Jim Watt. No, not the director of NIH, the director of the Heart Institute.
NHLBI.
Whatever it was called, it kept on changing its name. The director of that, he flew over to see me, and of course I was immediately inundated with invitations to come over to the States, etc., and to lecture and write papers. But it took years for British cardiology to become even, you might say, politely interested, never mind supportive. And that's been quite important in terms of all sorts of things.
So a review, a few years before that paper, a review actually said, of coronary heart disease said that exercise was a cause of heart attacks, rather than something which protected against heart attacks. So I suppose it was a sort of new idea.
And they weren't interested, really. Essentially, they weren't interested, and that was the fairest thing to say, because I knew quite a lot of them one way or another. through the London. And then were very polite. Parkinson was very polite and invited me home to give him a tutorial. He lived in Hampstead, quite near where I lived. And he remember going to his palatial. He was then the top consultant. Does the name mean anything, Parkinson?
Yeah.
His hero clinical papers.
Yeah.
And I remember him inviting me to give him a personal tutorial. I remember the chocolate and the chocolate biscuits and the coffee as much as I remember making an impression. Making an impression.
So that's your most influential paper. Which do you think's been your most underappreciated paper that should have been more influential than it was?
Well, that thing we did on minimum incomes. I was thinking in terms of one of your questions that I was alerted that, you know, the fox and the hedgehog. And I'm a two-headed hedgehog. If such a thing is conceivable, and I suppose it is now thoroughly conceivable. You see, interested in exercise on the one hand and equality on the other, or using equality as a general term. And that paper, which I say we had the least arises out of this equality thing. I was quite shocked. The government introduced a national minimum wage, which they pledged to do in the election manifesto when they were elected in '97, and very soon they appointed the usual commission of the great and the good to work out details and so forth. And there was a lot of discussion in the papers, at least two major debates in the House of Commons. To cut long story short, the whole thing seems to be produced without benefit of any sort of health input at all. And I ascertained later on with much difficulty that neither the Department of Health nor the Faculty of Public Health Medicine had made any input into this. And there wasn't any health input. The idea that this national minimum wage should at least consider, I don't say it should be the most important, by then I'd been house trained, I wouldn't say it's the most important. That we should consider the possibility of meeting health needs. So we set up a group here in the school to study this, and we eventually produced a report, which if you haven't seen, I'd be glad to send you a copy. You definitely would not have seen it. And it raised the whole issue of what are we doing with all this vast knowledge which we've created in the last 50 years. It sort of expanded out into that. See, because remember, I can talk about, literally, we started after the war. I mean, coronary heart disease was already important in the 1930s. We already had emergencies coming into UCH from Euston Station, and Thomas Lewis, my teacher, was very interested in it, and he repeated the sort of things that Osler had said years before about what we now call type A, the stressful businessman, you know. But virtually nothing was known. As I've said before. What was it? What were you on? What was it?
We were talking about your least appreciated paper.
Well, well, you see, from that time, but there was no research in the 1930s. Virtually nothing. There were some clinical papers. There was no research into etiology that you could call research. So all this happened in the sort of half century since the Second World War.
Yeah.
And this paper enlarged into another, not equally important, you can't compare importance. What are we doing with this growth of knowledge? This tremendous scientific consensual knowledge and major scientific knowledge. And what are we doing with it? And so that's as interesting an aspect of that paper, which we didn't really appreciate until by the time you get settled down, how do you cost a nutritious diet? Now, what have we learned about nutritious diet? Actually, the nutritious diet research, in fact, there was some done before the war, so happened. So it made the question even more gratuitous. I mean, you're talking not about 50 years of research, but 70, 80, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we've now got a group in the school studying this in relation to old age pensioners. And again, I've got the emphasis on what's the minimum income required. Needless to say, the government refused to fund this tiny application for funds. The government refused to. But age concern, a very enlightened way of, well, I say fund this, we need to pay for one executive officer, one research fellow, to tap all the resources that there are in the school. I'm working on this virtually half-time, but there's a lot of work being done on in terms of the housing needs and the social and health care. There'll be a major input trying to cost this and formulate this, etc. And with the whole issues of psychosocial relations, which we now know. I can see that we know how important relation to health and the whole problem of how you define these and cost these, because you've got to cost them if you're going to have any impact into government.
So how have you chosen the research questions that you want to address?
Well, in terms of these two main interests, and that's what I'm doing now. The other thing I'm doing now is I'm involved. I've had so much contact with exercise physiologists who do very elaborate studies on people. And when we carried out the National Fitness Test, National Fitness Survey, way back in 1990, published a few years later, we had the best physiologists in the country all working on it, and physiologically, in terms of, for instance, the determination of fitness, which is the key. We did what was the best scientific practice, as designed by our best physiologists. And of course, this is, in public health terms, this is hopeless. But my contact with I had so much contact with physiologists, and I've got such good personal relations with all these physiologists, that I have the outrageous idea that you could simplify these methods for use in regular routine public health. And we're now trying to do this. I won't say anything about the support that we're getting from the Department of Health, I'll omit that. But, so that's my exercise interest, which amalgamates the exercise and the public health.
But at the start, if you go back to the start of that work on exercise, how did you decide, what led to you deciding you wanted to...
Well, no hypothesis on exercise. The hypothesis is, as far as it was a hypothesis, that this would be related to occupation. We set up a study in a great variety of occupation groups, both to give us information on incidence, on frequency, on prevalence, and there were little hints in terms of social class distribution, with a concentration on the upper classes, and there were one or two other hints which I didn't know about. So later on that we discovered from rummaging in the literature. Anyhow, it seemed to me that occupation was a good way into this disease. It was far commoner in men than women. It increased in frequency as middle age advanced. There were some little suggestions about the social class. So we set up studies in a wide variety of occupations, land and transport notably, but the whole great range of civil service occupations, the National Union of Teachers, Marconi. We had set up a whole range. How we did all this on clerical labour, I mean, this is all pre-computer and all that. I mean, at various periods, we had a whole army of clerks working, literally an army of clerks, with the chief clerical officer up there, and the whole army of clerks filling in longhand. But this, fortunately, was the first observation we made. After 1 year, the first results we got from London Transport showed there's striking differences between drivers and conductors. And then I suppose were the tensest moments in my professional life. We had to wait till we got comparable data from the civil service, in particular from the post office. and there came out the same, that we got the same difference between drivers and conductors. We got between clerical officers and that sort of thing, and postmen. So by then we felt we were onto something. But these were very different times. There's no question of rushing into print or even with a preliminary statement. We spent years in testing this before we dared to publish. It's inconceivable nowadays in modern days that we just sat on this, and we tried to do as different studies as we could, being ignorant that Charles Darwin had shown us how to do this a long time ago, and long before we had of triangulation, etc. But we did produce evidence of different sorts which confirmed the hypothesis, and we only published as a hypothesis in 1953. And we spent the best part of the next 10 years, unfortunately, a lot of other groups in different parts of the world similarly. Paffenberger started up in San Francisco, and Taylor and Company. Taylor was a very close. Taylor and I became good friends. I remember. You don't want gossip on this sort of interview.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely. But Taylor, I remember we were at a conference in Washington. This would be sometime in the 1950s, and Henry Taylor, we had become good friends. Unlike Ansel Keys, he was only just in diet, but Taylor said, you've got to learn some exercise physiology. And we sat in my hotel room for a whole day, a solid day in Washington, and Henry Taylor started at dot and tutored me into the elements of exercise physiology. So that I wasn't just a sheer ignoramus, I was merely an average ignoramus. I've learned a lot from my friends one way and another.
And exercise came out as an important factor in those studies. What other possible causes were you investigating with respect to the coronary epidemic in those early studies?
Well, first we were very interested in the social aspects. That was my other main interest. And there was nothing very rewarding in that couldn't be explained by physical activity in those days. Then we quickly took up the emergent from clinical epidemiology. It was founded at the same time as we started our kind of work. Framingham started their kind of work. And we, as soon as we could, we took their ideas and tested them out on the busmen. And sure enough, the bus drivers and the bus conductors had very different lipid profiles, very different blood pressure patterns, you see, different, etc. We tested them out, so that again and again it was focusing on the differences of physical activity, which of course was more and more interesting to as I learned more and more about exercise physiology of physical activity. And as the exercise physiologists began to take this up
and as the other main focus of your work, inequalities, social inequalities in health, how did you start off researching that area?
Well, we didn't start, we continued all the time. We did studies on different towns, for instance. We worked a lot on official data. Studies in general practice were aborted largely. Well, they weren't exactly aborted, but they were diminished. The idea was that Richard Titmuss should be responsible for them, but he only stayed in the unit for a short time. As soon as he published his war history, he got invitations all over the place to chairs, and he went to LSE, and thereafter our relations we remained close friends, but little in terms of work. And I continued statistical work on that, Registrar General Statistics, and so speaking with all diffidence, when the government set up the committee, and Douglas Black set up the committee and had something to do with setting up the committee, it was Abel Smith who stimulated government to do it, and I was a pal of Abel Smith, as you can imagine, with Richard. Abel Smith was Timothy's main disciple, and we were all very, very close friends. So it was natural that joined the Black Committee, which is not really a committee, it was a tiny little group, and I drafted a lot of that report. And by then, I spent a lot of my time on that draft report, which in many ways is amateurish compared with more sophisticated. But I think in terms of social policy and social medicine, it's an important document. And was very unpopular, treated very badly by government, as you can imagine. And it's all very well to say to each other, damn them, but it was all very unpleasant.
Which of your contributions to the field would you most like to be remembered for?
Well, it has to be physical activity, because it started not really epidemiological work, but physiological work. This was a stimulus to the American physiology. Physiology was large, well, there was also some Scandinavian, but the physiology was very largely in America. They started a lot of work, and it still remains a major public health problem. And we're not getting anywhere. And it's in terms of social medicine, it's quite like the biggest social changes. We're the first generation in history where the generality of the population doesn't need to take any exercise. I mean, there's always been aristocracy or this and that, but the generality of the population nowadays doesn't need to do any physical activity, or virtually none. You know what I mean? Whether it's in occupation or in housekeeping or in transport, getting about. And this has all happened in the last, well, you might say this last half century that I keep on talking about. And all the emphasis remains on Zaki Chum in what's commonly an unhelpful and unfriendly social environment. And there's been virtually no social policy changes. And something which is a most social of conditions. It might be precipitated now with the epidemic of obesity. It might be. There's no signs of it yet. But it's hard to think of it. I mean, you've got encouragement of walking, and various towns are doing a bit about walking, and you get a town like York where it's an ideal situation, and you have wonderful walking facilities. And walking in Camden, where I live, typical urban mess.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go by the back streets, then you can take 10 minutes extra to get to the station. Okay, you see, you haven't got 10 minutes, you're already in. But I mean, walking in Camden, then you can go up to the Heath, etc., etc. I mean, there's been virtually no policy response towards one of the biggest or the biggest social change that there's been in modern times.
So you've talked about two areas, physical activity and inequalities in health, where you've clearly spent decades and decades working on initial ideas. Are there any ideas that you had that you didn't take forward in that way that you wish you had?
Violence. I was very keen to get in on violence. It seemed to me he was a major national failing that epidemiological methods could really make some contribution to. And it was too difficult. I'd have had to go into it much more seriously than I possibly could with my resources, intellectual and other. I would think today it remains a major. I'm surprised that epidemiologists haven't taken it up. There will have a little work on it.
What have been your major interests outside of your epidemiological work?
Too many.
Those are the major ones, are too many.
Too many. Well, I mean, I've always been interested in politics. And my generation, I mean, I've been a paid-up member of the Labour Party since October 1926, when I went up as an undergraduate to Glasgow University. All students joined the political party. We had 1,000 members in the Labour Party, 1,000 members in the Tory party, 1,000 members in the Scots Nats, and etc. We all belong. And every Friday we had very lively political debates. It's entirely different today, I'm told. Universities are nothing like this. And we had an official mind. James Maxton was our minder. He kept in close touch with us. We used to, it was a great privilege to meet him. He was a wonderful man, as you can visualise. I've always been interested in politics, and at times I've been active, both in general terms and as public health terms. I mean, there's three kinds of public health. I might say there's public health analysis, which we all do, and there's public health advocacy, which a lot of us do, and there's public health activism. I used to teach my students the 3 A's, and they're very difficult to keep apart when you've got to keep them apart, and often have to be brought together when it's very difficult and unwise to bring them together. You must be familiar with these problems. Well, public health activism has died out. Mrs. Thatcher killed it, and interestingly, there's been no revival. Public health advocacy is very little in sight. The most effective, you might say, is anti-smoking, which is, to a large extent, not public health. I mean, the lead against smoking was taken by the physicians. I remember the first meeting of the College of Physicians Committee. This goes back some time, 1960, I suppose, something like that, when we were brought together as a committee in the College of Physicians by Robert Platt, the president, and we introduced to each other, and I remember saying, we've got no MOH. You can't have this committee without MOH. And between us, we couldn't think of an MOH who was interested in smoking. So eventually, we persuaded a pal of mine, John Scott, who was the MOH of London County Council, and a close friend of mine. He came on. He was a generally very intelligent, as you can imagine, an able man, and he came on. But literally, the smoking story was taken up by physicians. I don't want to get into criticism of public health as it is today. It's had such a rough.
Other people do that, yeah.
Huh?
Other people do that.
And it's had self-treatment. It's been reorganised every few years. And the last reorganisation was the most radical of all, done without any piloting, without any preliminary discussion. And how it will work out, I don't know. Hopefully, it will.
In your opinion, what's been epidemiology's most important contribution to society?
Well, I think that through social medicine, we've made it clear to, in general, you might say in general, and certainly to the thinking political classes, that health and disease are social as well as biological issues. And even though they can't do anything about the social, they feel they should.
Yeah.
And I would say that by now there's no escaping this, and I think we can claim a lot of the credit for that. The other thing is, in terms of medicine and research, is that we've shifted the paradigm. We've established the importance of the population alongside the clinical and the laboratory for any serious discussion of etiology and natural history. As I say, the pioneers like Major Greenwood had very little impact. Why, I don't know. But by now it's accepted. And there's been this, in Kuhn's terms, I think this is a real paradigm shift, technically a paradigm shift. And by now, the natural phenomena is to study the epidemiology of everything under the sun, which is again what Kuhn describes. And what the next paradigm shift will be, I don't know. I don't think there are any signs yet of abandoning this one.
Well, that next question was, do you have any predictions about what the future might hold for our field? So.
Well, we're in for a tough time because of this tremendous overselling of the biological. The overselling was probably necessary now to get the necessary funds, but of course the only way you got the necessary funds was to take them from somebody else, which
You mean genetic studies?
Genetics, the whole of molecular medicine, as the medicine which and the genetics and the biobankers, the most glorious. We're in for a tough time from that, and the exaggerated, well, it's my personal opinion, the exaggerated hopes we've got for this, particularly in the short to medium term. And on the other hand, and quite importantly, we've got this way in which the RCT has taken over science. And you can't talk about social policy nowadays with social policy without them dragging in the RCT. They haven't got a clue what's involved and the limitations of the RCT, but they feel they must talk about it. They must, to show their respectability, you see. And this again is, I'm finding it quite a nuisance in talking about social policy and social policy changes. We have to think away. And we haven't created a scientific language and a scientific methodology in terms of social policies to compare with the RCT.
Yeah.
And it's in its field. And it's filling up empty spaces. I don't know whether you think that's exaggerated, what I'm saying.
Did you ever do any randomised controlled trials, or
Yes,
tried to do
yes,
any?
on clofebrate.
Oh, of course, yeah.
We did that, which was a disaster. Still not very clear why. Peter says our numbers were too small, but we studied them statistically endlessly and thought the numbers were adequate. We gave infinite thought to that, and to that aspect. Obviously, I should think quite just mistaken. And we were very unlucky with the clofebrate. I mean, there was a lot of bad luck there.
Chose the wrong drug.
Yeah. We were a bit unlucky there. And we attempted our CTs on diet.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Very amateurish results. The whole altogether diet study has been disappointing. Could do with one of your reviews.
You've done one.
Not by me, but you could do one.
Collaboration is essential for successful epidemiological studies. What have you found to be the most important ingredient or ingredients for a good collaboration?
Well, of course, I don't know that we were a good collaboration. I mean, I hadn't thought of this really seriously until I got this to your questions. And trying to think back, it was quite clear in our unit that what mattered was expertise and what contribution you make, not your rank or seniority. And this was very difficult in our unit because, of course, the medics, you see, were paid so much more than the others. And this is an insoluble problem. On the one hand, there was no question of the medics giving up their pay. We certainly spent every penny that we had, and we lived a fairly modest, well, I suppose it's more than modest. Right? Anyhow, we always had the cheapest little car, you see, and that sort of thing. So this was a major problem. But I think we did establish that it was expertise and the contribution you were making, even if I remember working very closely with Martin Gardner from the day he joined the unit, which was straight from Cambridge. We took him on as an absolute beginner, and I was very attracted to some of his ideas. I remember we settled down together, the two of us, working closely, although I was the most senior person and he was the most junior person, but that aspect didn't come into it. The other thing is that we socialised a lot. Don't know whether that still exists. We were in and out of each other's houses, and one chap was the expert on wine. Whether he knew anything about wine, I haven't a clue, but he was the expert on wine, and we never dared to have a dinner party or anything without consulting John, you see. And we did a lot of stuff. I don't know whether socialising still goes on. Quite likely it doesn't.
I think it depends where you are.
It depends where you are, yes.
What about
Generally, it was much more social life than my impression. We were in and out of each other's houses a great deal.
what about external collaborations outside of the unit? Did you have any?
I was very much in touch with the LSE people through Richard. And through Richard I got to know David Donison well. who was a colleague of Richard, may even been a disciple, I don't think so. But through Richard I got to know a lot of the LSE people, his juniors like people like David Bishop and Mike Redden and so forth. I've continued in touch with in one way and another. And I got involved in health services, and this became a major part of my life through politics, as much as when Labour became increasingly influential in forming governments. When they set up the Seaborne Committee on Social Services, for instance, I was the only doctor on it. I remember protesting to government, this is ridiculous to have an epidemiologist and a public health man, you must have a clinician. And they couldn't do anything about it, they agreed. They found that they couldn't get it passed. I said, you must have a paediatrician or a psychiatrist, you must have a clinician. And maybe that is an important fact. I wonder if it's ever been written, up. And I was on Kenneth Robinson's personal advisory group, where we were allowed to talk very freely about health services.
And in any international collaborations that were...
I was in WHO a lot through coronary heart disease. The very first meeting they had, there was Ansel Keys and myself. I think George Pickering, or if he was not there, he certainly came to the next meeting. And one or two others, but the very initial meetings on coronary heart disease are way back in the 1950s. And I remained in touch with WHO for a long time. Afterwards I tried to get them interested in these sort of things in relation to developing countries, but failed. And of course I did a lot of studies in coronary heart disease registers and a whole lot of it, and a whole lot of very useful work. But somehow that took up my international limit. I wasn't very keen on international travel anyhow. We had a family rather late in life, and I was very keen on family holidays rather later than most. It's a question of age, you see. I was very keen on family holidays when other people were glad to be glad to have got rid, glad that the families had deserted them, if you know what I mean. You're still experienced, you've still got that ahead of you. And I was involved in some of these international things, of course.
What's your assessment of the current state of health of epidemiology?
I'm very worried about the reducing contacts with public health and social medicine. It seems to me to be reducing when the problems are as great as ever are greater. On the other hand, in terms of sophistication of the techniques of the discipline itself, they're incomparably greater. Very sophisticated, very elaborate, and of course we're not making the kind of discoveries that we used to make. Now why that is usually dismissed as we were in on the easy stuff, and sure we were. I mean, you don't get a disease like coronary heart disease presented to you. Although in fact Alzheimer's was, and it's never been very clear to me why we've made such a little contribution with Alzheimer's disease. It's never been something your journal might try and tease out. We've made very modest contributions to Alzheimer's. You may say it's for want of trying, but it's been quite a lot of effort. I've never seen it teased out, this issue, for epidemiologists, because our contribution has been quite modest.
Mm.
As for moving into major social fields like violence, we just haven't. Which would have been a natural progression if we'd gone on developing, instead of being taken over what you might call the RCT school. I know that you and Shah have got a lot of ideas of the same kind, or similar. The other noticeable thing, of course, is that from the beginning we were interested in health services research. And the MRC were all against this. Mellenby, no. First of all, he said there should be this kind of work should be done by the Ministry of Health. And you don't mean to tell me that they're starting this National Health Service without doing, since he had lunch probably once a week with the Chief Medical Officer. That's the time when the country was went from the Athenaeum. I used to have lunch in the Athenaeum with the folks there until the last hour. He used to invite me to lunch every 2 or 3 months, and there would be all these people. But he said, essentially, let's get MRC into politics. We don't want it. But Richard Titmuss said he was still going to be assistant director, deputy director of the unit at that time. We insisted, we said, we're going to come into a chronic disease era when health services are terribly important for people's health. It's quite clear to us, although we're in the very beginnings of modern treatment. How can you ignore it? And on the other hand, I'd seen quite a bit of operational research during the war. John Squire and his operational research unit were built in our hospital. You remember the name John Squire? He was the first director of Northwick Park, a very young, brilliant young professor of medicine, and during the war he was director of an operational research unit, and that unit was billeted in us in Imphal, in northeast India, for quite a period. And we had endless discussions about how appropriate a lot of their methodology was to apply to the kind of problems of health services, which were full of these problems. Just before the war, PEP, does it mean anything? PEP, which was then a big think tank.
What does it stand for?
Political and Economic Planning.
Okay.
It's a big think tank, funded, I think, by Marks and Spencer, by the CIFs. They were certainly in on it. And they did a major review of health services, which has been completely forgotten. Must have been published in 1937, 38, this sort, probably before the war. And it was glaringly obvious that here was a real situation for research, for study. And the first thing we did when we established our unit was, well, as I say, Melanie was all against it. But, very interestingly, the MRC had a different principle as well, or another principle, and that was to choose people and then let them get on with it. And I remember him saying once to Richard and myself, I don't know what you boys are up to, but you'd better get on with it. But very interestingly, Himsworth was later on in quite a different personality and a clinician. Melanie was a biochemist, a physiologist. Himsworth was a professor of medicine, that's how I knew Himsworth. His future wife was my first HP at UCH. I knew him quite well. He was also, he says, the MRC is very happily situated. We belong to the Privy Council, which is the least political government department. We get an annual grant increasing every year. Why should we get into these politics? As soon as you get into health service, you'll get into politics. Why should we? And we have the, and Himsworth rather turned it round to say, well, by then, the Maudsley was also into this. And Himsworth rather turned it down, well, perhaps this will bring us different angles on etiology, which seemed to me, but anyhow, but later on, and a later secretary of the MRC, it was such an odd remark that I won't quote his name, said to me, there's no intellectual challenge in health services research. And at the time I thought this was, and only very recent, years later, I remembered that remark. I found myself saying at this discussion in the school, you can guess about what, saying there are no 5 stars in health services research. Now this was a remark I made just like that, I hadn't thought of it. It was a friendly discussion.
Yeah.
The school did badly, as you know, in the last You got a 5-star, we only got a 5. And we were discussing the future, and it turned out that the 5s were going to do badly because the government amalgamated the previous. Did you 5-star in the previous? So you're just 5-star 1. But Oxford was double 5-star, and Cambridge were double 5-star. So Oxford was 3rd, and Bristol was 3rd, with only 1 5-star, and we were nowhere with only 1 5, well, 2 5s actually. We were nowhere. And I remember during this discussion, and I saying there are no 5 stars in health services research, and I wonder to what extent that corresponds to the remark that this Secretary of the MRC had made to me that there are no intellectual challenges. And I disagreed with him. He said, well, what are they? And I only could produce one. Mind you, we were walking. We were walking down the Oxford Cross at lunchtime. And I only could produce 1 5-star observation in health services research.
What's that?
Goffman. And you know, since then, I mean, I'm sure if we sat down,
I think a couple more.
we could produce a couple more. But in this gossiping around the quads in the half hour after lunch at some MRC meeting, I can't remember what the meeting was, and I was working with, I won't mention his name, the Secretary of the MRC, or he may already have retired. No, I think he was still the Secretary. Now, needless to say, he'd never heard of Goffman. Just as Howard Florey and company, in my first confrontation with the MRC, had never heard of Farr or Goldberger or Snow, a bit doubtful. I think they changed it when I mentioned Snow. But I mean, apart from Goffman, we'd find it difficult, I think. In terms of making sure that you get 5 stars next time, if it's the same system, this school's investment in health services research has got to be looked at.
What do you think are the ripest opportunities for epidemiology?
Today,
Yeah.
moving into new areas, and this major issue of how we begin to apply so much of what we've learned, which involves all sorts of intellectual problems, and what is a scientific consensus, what is major scientific observation which is not consensus, and what is consensus. How do you relate this to policy developments, which is at equal difficult but quite different policy issues. I mean, we're working on that now in relation to this old age thing. We're trying to formulate some of these ideas. But you see, you get a simple notion like seatbelts, and the government passes the law. And within 6 months, if you're not wearing a seatbelt, you're
banged up.
You see, but now the government is equally enthusiastic about 5 a day, and they haven't a clue. And they don't think socially. For years I've been trying to persuade them to have free swimming. So this is, there's collateral evidence that might work. You don't need evidence from free eye tests or free museum entries. But anyhow, it will give such a message. And now they've got a tiny little pilot for children, one London borough which couldn't think of anything else.
What do you think are the biggest risks that epidemiology faces?
Well, I think I've mentioned these already. I mean, the way that biology, genetics, molecular science has taken over, which means it's taken over funds. I mean, I'm not au fait with this, and I don't know anything about Wellcome funding, but I know a bit about MRC funding, and this is a major issue. And the other issue which I mentioned was the model of the RCT has been the answer to all scientific, the establishment, and how you apply RCTs to sink estates, somebody else will work out. I've no doubt they'll be ready to do it. It's a 3-year project.
What would be the single most important piece of advice you could give to a new epidemiologist starting their career?
Hinterland, it's a wrong word, but it belongs elsewhere. I think you must come in with something else. You need stats, of course. In my time, it was statistics or medicine. Nowadays it could be statistics or medicine or molecular science or sociology. I think the most important of these is sociology. And maybe social psychology. I've never been very clear about what social psychology is. I've got clear ideas of sociology. It seems to me that our collaboration there over the years, we've talked about it endlessly. And in fact, we were investigating before we knew what it was. And we used their concept, we discovered concepts that they discovered years before. But it's right open, it seems to me. And it's very little of it.
So you mean come in with an ancillary skill, be it sociology or molecular biology
or medicine
or something,
as well as statistics. And it's taken for granted you have statistics.
Yes.
And as I say, in my time, all the rest of us, they're only a tiny handful. I mean, now, as I say, it's an industry, but by my time, when we started, in this country, there was nobody else doing coronary heart disease. There was Dolan Hill doing lung cancer. There were the Framingham people in Boston. There were Ansel Keys and Company in Minneapolis. That's about it. Must be another one or two, I can't remember now.
So that was mainly it.
That was mainly it. I mean, now we all had some statistics. And I say, my epidemiology is heavily medical, too heavily medical. On the other hand, quite a lot of the epidemiology I've done was based on the fact that I've been very well trained in morbid anatomy. I've been very well trained in clinical cardiology. I had a remarkable experience in clinical cardiology. I was Thomas Lewis's clerk for nearly a year, and I was his house physician, you see. So I had personal coaching from Thomas Lewis for virtually 18 months. And in morbid anatomy, I fell under the influence of not the UCH, of the man of the London.
Whose records you?
Who became a remarkable man, a great. Well, anyhow, but my epidemiology quite likely suffered from this medicine. Ansel Keys brought in physiology. Well, I say medicine. It's another branch. Physiology was another branch of medicine, and he brought in physiology and his nutritional aspects of physiology. He was a nutritionist essentially, wasn't he? But I regard that as part of medicine. The Framingham people were clinicians.
And
Dolan Hill was essentially statisticians. Bradford Hill was a statistician, and Doll was very junior. I don't know what else other interests he developed.
And if you were starting today, starting off again, and you could choose any field, not necessarily epidemiology, but with your sort of background, what sort of field do you think would you go into?
Public health.
As opposed to purely research-based epidemiology?
Well, in public health you've got to do a certain amount of research, but hopefully you can do it locally. And if we succeed in our physiological studies, we'll have a whole new apparatus of assessing physical fitness in the population and functional physical capacities. See, the kind of thing that shakes me is that physiologists have discovered years ago this situation of sarcopenia. Do you know what it is? Well, you see, this is typical. This is typical. It's disastrous. As a part of normal aging, there's a loss of muscle mass and of muscle strength, therefore, from the 40s at the latest. This is normal aging. Happens to everybody. The athletes as well as the sluggards. Now it's been demonstrated now by RCTs, of course. They're not going to be cut out. That you can, by exercise, you can make big differences to this. You can, in fact, in these terms, rejuvenate old people by 10, 15 years. Now, public health has totally failed to take this on board. But totally. So that, I did a poll in this school when I first was taught this by my pal, one of my physiological pals, and I just stopped a dozen people in the school, I think it was one of them had a vaguely something to do with them, exchange rate mechanism or something. He thought. But I wouldn't expect you to know about sarcopenia, which is a ridiculous term. I mean, it's so unfriendly. But what term would you knew about muscle wasting and muscle, you knew about that.
Yeah.
But public health?
Doesn't.
At all. Now here's a major, now there are a collection of these issues, which public health, again in terms of applying all this vast knowledge which we've acquired in recent years, this is fairly recent, and there are beautiful studies in it, and it has been demonstrated beyond what, I remember talking to Liam about it. He's interested in so many things.
Well, that's the future, so that's a good place to stop. Thanks a lot.